Recording in progress.
Is this on? Can you hear? Okay. All right. Thank you. So if you recall, we started with this in September. This is the second part. This is the part I didn't get done in September. And you guessed it, I probably won't get this done either. So we'll see how we go with this. We're going to look at these religious communities during the Second Great Awakening. The reason why I thought this might be interesting is because, of course, the origins of our church come out of the same time period, in the same geographic space. And I thought it'd be interesting to, as we're going through these, you can compare what they were doing in that same area to what we ended up doing. And so that's what I thought we would do. And we're going to get to look at today a second restoration movement. Our movement was called the Restoration Movement. This is a second one, and it would be interesting to compare those two. So we'll see how this goes. First, I'd like to review a little bit this idea of state religions, and I wanted to talk about what a state religion is, and then look at why the United States has so many alternative religious movements. Definition of state religion: one is an official religion of a country is established by law. So this is our religion for our country. This is the normal religion. The state is invested in that religion, and so forth. Okay. European examples: we have Anglican in England. We have Catholicism in Italy, France, and Spain, and there's others as well. For a while, Lutheran was the state religion of Germany, and so forth. Okay, although Germany is split between Catholics and Lutherans, but the First Amendment of the United States Constitution says we're not going to do that. Okay, this is the wording of the first. This is how the First Amendment starts. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That was so important to the people who wrote the Bill of Rights, that's the first thing in the first of the amendments to the Bill of Rights. So that's what's really important. I should point out, though, that Protestant Christianity has functioned as a de facto state religion in the United States ever since before our beginning. Almost all bastions of power were conceived of through a Protestant religion lens. Almost virtually all of our presidents, except for two, have been Protestants. And the two were John Kennedy and Joe Biden. They were both Catholics. Other than that, everybody's been Protestant. Originally, it was what was called the mainstream Protestant churches. You can see a list of them here: Lutheran, Episcopalian, Presbyterian, and Methodist. And in case you're interested in trivia, the one religion which more presidents have been than anything else is Episcopalian. So almost all of them early in our history, not too many since then. But beginning in the 1970s, and with increasing intensity for each decade after that up to the present time, evangelical Protestantism has evolved as the de facto state religion of the United States. And that's pretty much where we're at right now, okay? Now, why does the U.S. have so many non-traditional forms of Christianity? We have a lot. We're noted for our diversity of different kinds of religions that have come up. And here's a list of, this is a cultural geography question. And so cultural geographers have weighed in on this. And here's some of the things that they have suggested, okay? A really important one was, not all, but a lot of the early European immigrants came for freedom of religion. And the reason why they were coming for freedom of religion is because they were coming from European countries that had state religions, and they weren't part of that state religion. And so the government could bring power against them. Laws were enacted against their religions and things like that. And so as a result, they were coming here, assuming the United States was a blank slate where they could just do what they wanted, pretty much. And so that they brought the idea of a nonconformist religion with them, and that has served to be an important template for the cultural expression of religion in the United States. That early start of nonconformity has, carried through. The second thing people pointed out is that the United States, Americans have a very different and sort of odd notion of freedom, which is an important concept to us. It's vested in a lot of cases in individual freedom, and it can be summarized as nobody can tell me what to do. I can do whatever I want. That's an odd way of looking at freedom, and almost nobody else in the world looks at it that way, but we do. And that, of course, lends itself to people saying, I can worship any way I want, nobody can tell me what to do, I'll worship however I want, dang it, And so alternative religions get born rather easily out of that. The third one is the high literacy rates that we had at the very beginning of our country. White male literacy in 1800 was 90%. Now, that's just white males. Slaves were not allowed to read. It was forbidden to let slaves read. Native Americans didn't speak English, so they weren't reading in English. Women were not given the educational opportunities that men were. So the overall average was lower than that. But white men who ran everything was about 90%. There are all kinds of anecdotes of ordinary farmers plowing in the fields behind their mules, guiding their plow, reading a book while they were doing that at this time. I mean, this was a big deal. People read, and read a lot, read more than they do now. And you can see, I thought that was just when the Second Great Awakening was beginning, was about 1800. So the current adult U.S. literacy rate is 79%. So we're not as literate as we were in 1800 if you just compare us to the white males. Okay. This is, of course, is everybody. But what I found was interesting, 54%, a majority of adult Americans today read at less than a 6th grade level. A majority do. So we don't read very much, not like white males used to, okay? Now, the reason why that comes into play here is that a lot of people could read the Bible in 1800. But the thing is, they often weren't really great readers. They were taught pretty much to sign their name and to read a few simple documents. And so they were struggling through the Bible, and a lot of times they weren't understanding what they were reading, or they were misunderstanding what they were reading. And so this gave rise to this notion that, oh, the Bible says this, so we can do this. We're going to have this religion because the Bible says so. And they probably weren't really reading the Bible very, very accurately. So that was another factor that can lead to nonconformist religious views. And the fourth thing that people have pointed out is Americans have long valued practical knowledge over intellectual knowledge. We pride ourselves on being practical people. We don't like that theory kind of stuff. We don't like intellectual thought nearly as much as a lot of other cultures do. And so with that in mind, there's a big, deep skepticism of experts in our culture, has been for a long, long time. Those pointy-headed intellectuals who don't know what's really going on, right? Practical knowledge has always been treasured. And in this respect, that meant a rejection of traditional established religions, which were, anchored by seminary-trained ministers, those intellectual, pointy-headed religious types, in favor of experiential and emotional religion based on personal influence of what people called the Spirit. Okay, the Spirit told me to do this. I don't care what that guy says. I don't care what his scholarship in the Bible says. The Spirit told me to do this. And you end up with nonconformist religions. So this is all the reasons why people have suggested that we have so many nonconformist religions. Any questions or comments or observations about this?
So,
yeah.
The high literacy rate was really directly religious based.
Yeah, totally.
Puritans had a very high emphasis on education.
Yes, they did.
And so that
the Calvinists in general did, yeah.
So a lot of what they were learning were, their schools were religious based. So
this is a really important point. All the early universities were religious based. Harvard, Yale, they were all designed to train ministers. That's what they were there for.
And first libraries were on East Coast.
First libraries, all of that was religious based. That's a good point. Thanks for bringing that up. So we've had 4 Great Awakenings. We did this last time. We're concerned with the second one here, 1790 to 1845. Mostly in New England, but as we'll see today, the Upland South had a role to play as well, and we'll get to that today a little bit as well. So here's the Second Great Awakening. This is the one we're focusing on. Characteristics, religious revivals. And we're going to talk about the granddaddy of all religious revivals today, which kicked off this whole trend in the Second Great Awakening and gave rise to the other kind of restoration movement. But that created the camp tradition in U.S. Religion, which of course we have as reunions and camps and youth camps and adult camps and so forth. So it came out of that Second Great Awakening. It was intensely anti-intellectual, overt rejection of rationalism or logical thought. Focus was on religious enthusiasm and emotional and ecstatic religion. That goes along with the revivals. Okay, revivals are all about emotional and ecstatic religious experience. So Presbyterians, Methodists, and Baptists were particularly strong, gave rise, though, to a large number of nonconformist folk religious movements. A lot of them embraced what they called the primitive gospel. That's the New Testament church, the church that Jesus established, and they all thought that was the church we're supposed to follow and be part of. And this was really common in the Second Great Awakening and was very common. That's what Joseph Smith was talking about too, reestablishing the New Testament church. The other things, individual revelation and utopianism, were all big characteristics of this movement, and all of the churches we're talking about today have both of those. Okay? So that's just a little bit of review. We talked earlier, September 14th, about the restoration movement that we came out of. Joseph Smith Jr., we'll call those the Smith Restoration Movement, to characterize it from the other restoration movement that we'll be talking about. The Adventists, William Miller, remember he was predicting the end of the world. It didn't work, kept not working, and finally people said, enough of this. But enough people held on that today there are 19 million followers of the Adventists, mostly Seventh-day Adventists, is the largest of those denominations. So we're going to look at 3 others today. The Oneida Community, which was founded by John Humphrey Knowles. Remember, another characteristic is that charismatic leaders, often there were problems when that charismatic leader was either died or was no longer involved or whatever, and the churches often fell apart. Not always, but often did, or at least evolved, shall we say. And John Humphrey Knowles was that charismatic leader for the Oneida Community. It only lasted until the 1880s. It disbanded in 1881 as a religious movement, but they had gotten into manufacturing. We're going to talk about this a little bit later on. The Oneida Corporation is still one of the most important corporations in terms of dinnerware in the United States. And we'll come back to that a little bit later on. The second one we're going to look at is the Society of Universal Friends. We're going to talk about the conflict of what the name is of the religious charismatic leader who referred to themselves as the public universal friend, but was born Jemima Wilkinson. No current followers. The movement just collapsed and burned in the 1880s, and there's nobody left. And then the Restoration movement, not of Joseph Smith, had three important early founders. We'll talk about them later on. And there's three groups that came out of that, which are still current: Churches of Christ, Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and then a group called the Independent Christian Church. So we'll talk about all that if we have time, which I don't think we will. Commonalities of belief. What almost all of these, all five of the churches we've talked about, but these three that we're going to look at today, founded by a charismatic leader, had stability and continuity issues after the leader died or was no longer involved. Second, the soon-to-be manifested return of Jesus to the earth and the ushering in of the end times. This was a really big part of the Second Great Awakening theology. Utopian communal living is kind of varied in form and intensity with which group you're talking about, but utopianism was part of all of these movements. The importance of revelation, which fueled nonconformist beliefs, because a lot of the nonconformist beliefs came because God gave me a revelation, and here it is, and this is what we're supposed to do now, And then each developed a nonconformist view towards marriage and relationships between men and women. This is a little bit less true in the Restoration movement, the new one we're going to introduce today. But still, this was a striking indication of what was going on in the Second Great Awakening. And we'll see how that is manifest. We talked about polygamy in our movement as an example of this. We talked about William Miller, whose end-time prophecies meant that people just simply weren't getting married, weren't having babies, weren't going that way because the world's about to end. Why do that? And so we'll see how that works. So here's a map showing the ones we've talked about already: the Smith Restoration at Palmyra, New York. Lowhampton is the Adventist Center here in New York. Oneida and Jerusalem, the Society of Universal Friends, are also both in upstate New York, and this is where the Second Great Awakening was most powerful. It's called the Burned Over District because it was the fires of revivalism were so strong, it like burned over the state. It was upstate New York, this part of New York. The other restoration group had two branches which came together. One started down here in Kentucky, and one started here in Western Pennsylvania. So that's the Upland South connection, which was also there in the Second Great Awakening. So I just thought you might want to see geographically where all these places are. Let's look at John Humphrey Nose and the Oneida community as our first example of this. Now there's some interesting things coming here. And so I think we should take the time to discuss them if you want to. Nose especially developed some really interesting thoughts, which might surprise you a little bit. So we'll talk about those a little bit. At the height of the Second Great Awakening, Nose, at the age of 20, went through a really intense spiritual experience. And he decided, boy, I'm just all on fire now with the Spirit. And he became especially obsessed with the end times and with millennialism and all that kind of stuff. He came from money and from a powerful family. His father was in the House of Representatives. His mother was an aunt of a president. So he came from, powerful stock. And so after his religious conversion here, he decided he wanted to go to Yale University and study theology. Yale was a theological school, at the time. It's not now, of course. There is a theology department there. It's a really good one. But they had to do everything else too. But at this time, it was mostly theology. And so all of his professors were ministers and ordained people and people who were theologians. So now, he was obsessed with the millennial reign. And during his sophomore year at Yale, he decided he wanted to determine the exact date when the second coming of Jesus was going to be. And he wanted to know what that was. And he was studying really hard and so forth. Remember, this is what got William Miller into hot water, was trying to figure out the same thing. So this was a common sort of notion. Joseph Smith said, it's Latter-day Saints. We're the Latter-day Saints. It's coming really soon. He just didn't give a date. So this was a common idea then. And he made, in his second year at Yale, what he considered a major theological discovery. That is, Christ's second coming had already taken place. It was in 70 AD, almost 2,000 years ago. And that humans were now living in what's called the post-millennial age. Okay? So he thought this was a brilliant breakthrough of individual revelation that he received. And he began to try to figure out what it all meant. What's the implications of that? And what he came up with was that if Christ had already returned, the earth was perfected. In his way of looking at the millennial reign, Christ came and perfected the earth. So the earth was perfected already. That meant, according to him, Christianity would be a lie unless people were also truly free of sin already. So a true Christian were those that were perfect and free of sin. That's what the mark of a true Christian was, because Jesus had already come and had already perfected the earth. This insight gave him a second religious conversion, and he proclaimed or started believing that he did not sin and was a real Christian. So he was incapable of sin. You can probably see where the problems with that is, if you don't think you can ever make a mistake. Okay? So he embraced that idea with a passion, kind of a common idea during the Second Great Awakening. He felt it was not only possible to be free of sin in this lifetime, but was required if one was a real Christian in the post-millennial age. So that was the mark of a real Christian, be perfect. No sin, perfect. He spoke a lot with fervor on this, as new converts often do. His friends began to think he was insane. Excuse me. And his professors began to think he was a heretic. So from the time of his second conversion, he began to argue that because he had surrendered his will to God and was perfect, then everything he decided to do was perfect, because his heart was perfect. The basis of the idea was that his independent will came from God, and so it was perfect and divine. So you can see where he's going with this. He claimed this new relationship meant that traditional moral standards, as well as the normal laws of society, no longer applied to him. Nobody could tell him what to do, right? Because he knew better than everybody already, because he was perfect. He began acting on whatever impulse and thought crossed his mind, regardless of the consequences. And he publicly declared himself free of sin, which caused an outrage at Yale, and he was expelled. Okay? Now, let's look at marriage, because this is what, when you talk about the united community, everybody immediately goes to marriage. That's where they all go. He married in 1838. For 6 years, it was a traditional marriage. They were living in Vermont, by the way, in case you're curious about the geography. It is really hard when a woman miscarries. Really, really hard. And she had 4 of them in 6 years. And this had a profound impact on her, I'm sure, but on Noyes as well. And he began to doubt the whole concept of traditional marriage, is where it led him. Okay? So in 1846, after 6 years of marriage, he developed a romantic attachment to one of his followers. And she was married, and he convinced that woman and her husband and his wife that we're going to enter into what he called a complex marriage, which essentially means both men married both women, and both women married both men. Okay? He was immediately arrested for charges of adultery, because adultery was against the law at that time, and fled to New York State to avoid prosecution, both, and founded the Oneida Community. So that's how he got to New York. He left Vermont at a time when state law was really important. He could avoid that adultery charge by just leaving the state, and he went to New York. So the Oneida Community functioned from 1848 to 1881 in what is now called Oneida, New York. At its peak, 300 people lived in the community. Here they are in 1860. Okay, the members of that. They embraced manufacturing to support themselves, were very successful at it. They were really good at this. Fruit and vegetable canning, silk spinning, which was a big deal in the 1800s. Manufacturing animal traps and leather bags, but especially in dinnerware. They were making dinnerware, forks, knives, spoons, that kind of stuff. So here's residents of the Oneida Community. They had a big thing called the Mansion House. You can see it here, which is still a National Historic Marker today. That's still, you can rent it for occasions, wedding, ceremonies and things like that, and all that kind of stuff. One thing I found interesting was, this is an probably an 1860s or so photograph. That's about the time that photography got common enough that they were taking pictures of things like just people standing around in the front yard. Notice the women are all wearing bloomers. And at that time, that was a strong feminist statement. It was a way of showing that they were wearing essentially men's clothes, pants, under their skirts. That's what bloomers were. And it was a strong feminist statement. So we'll see in a minute, women and men were basically granted egalitarian equal rights in the Oneida community. It was a perfectionist society. If you made a mistake, you were hauled before everybody and you were criticized. They raked you over the coals, basically, and tried to get you back on the way, the good path, and so forth. And they practiced Christian utopian communalism. All resources were communally owned and shared. So everybody had whatever they needed. And nobody went hungry and everybody shared. And they were making a lot of money because their manufacturing was successful. So they were able to do this. They became major employers of local people who were not members of the community because they had so much manufacturing going on, their community couldn't do it all. But except for a few specific, very specialized tasks, everybody did everything in the community. Everybody worked at every job. This was part of the communalism of the community. So women and men given equal rights and opportunities, equal power within the community, but what's attracted most attention is this idea of complex marriage. And in fact, Noyes is credited with inventing the term free love. Basically, every single woman in the community and every single man in the community were all married to each other. So it was extremely rare for a couple to be dedicated to each other. Okay? They had really low birth rates because birth control was strictly practiced. And a form of eugenics was practiced. If you wanted to have a kid, they matched you up with somebody they thought would produce a really good kid within the community. Children were weaned at 1 year of age and removed from their parents and raised communally. So the children were everybody's children. There were times when I kind of wished I had 5 or 6 or 10 or 15 other parents taking care of my kids because I needed a break. And I think Teresa would testify to that too. But this is a kind of an interesting, kind of harsh way of raising children, I think. So the Oneida community began to decline. The reasons why: John Humphrey Nose was aging. He was trying to pass leadership to his son Theodore, who was an agnostic. And so the religious underpinnings of the whole community were gone. And that really got in the way of people's belief systems. He also was kind of a slacker and didn't have his father's leadership skills. He also had a rival. There was another member of the community that wanted to be in charge, and they were fighting for it. And this is never a good thing to have the success of your community. A professor at a nearby college launched the campaign against the community primarily because of complex marriage. And they finally eliminated that in 1879 because it was so divisive in the community. But as a result of these outside attacks, John Humphrey Nose finally left. He went to Canada to avoid prosecution of various laws, and because he had broken a number of laws relating to complex marriage, because of complex marriage. And he died there without ever returning to the United States. So the community disbanded in 1881, but the manufacturing was still really profitable, so they reorganized themselves as a corporation. And they carried on, primarily focusing on dinnerware, and they dominated the market all through the 20th century. They still are a going concern today, of course, but there's other people now that they don't have quite the dominance they once had. But it's still a respected manufacturer of dinnerware. This sterling silver set sold for $1,900, but their normal stuff that you and I might consider buying is something like this, which now is priced at about $60. It's just stainless steel, not silver. Revenue in 2025, $456 million. That's even more money than I have, which is saying a lot because so you get it. That was the United Community, and now they're a corporation. Any comments about the United Community and John Humphrey Nose?
Where did they come up with the Oneida term?
It was a local Native American term. What's that? Because that's geographically where they were located, I guess, and they call it the Oneida area or whatever. And so they just took that as the name of their community and so forth. But, okay. Our next one is the Society of Universal Friends. As we're going to point out here, she rejected, I'll say she this time, but she rejected all personal pronouns. And so I'm going to try to refer to her as they or them, which is how she referred to herself. When I say they or them, I'm not talking about the group. I'm talking about the individual person, okay? Because it's a plural term, but we just simply don't have non-gendered personal pronouns in English. We just don't have them. So people use plural terms sometimes for that. She was born Jemima Wilkinson. She suffered a severe illness, probably typhus, claimed that she died and then came back to life. She referred to herself as the universal friend, or they did, sorry. And they said that their soul had ascended into heaven and God had given them new lives without gender and charged with preaching the message of God And at that time, they said that Jemima Wilkinson no longer existed. So from that point on, the name was Public Universal Friend, and refused to assign themselves to any gender or use gendered pronouns at all, of any kind. Dressed in a traditional mixture of men's and women's clothing, and identified very much as non-binary. They preached the rest of their life, dying in 1819, building up a religious movement called the Society of Universal Friends. The Friend had been born into a Quaker family. Their name, the Quakers are called the Society of Friends, and so that influences the name of their group. But she broke with the Quakers on a number of things. Sorry, they broke with the Quaker on a number of things. They did accept the idea of a peaceable kingdom on earth, a utopian kingdom on earth, and they were very much involved or preached very much on that. But they broke with them on the authority to speak. The Friend thought that everyone had authority to speak, and the Quakers limited that authority, and that bothered them. They were a champion of women's rights and abolition of slavery, champion of the rights of indigenous Native Americans. They preached, again, they being the individual, preached fiery and passionate sermons espousing a utopian communal society. Passionate and fiery. I would like to go back in time and hear one of those, just for fun. The Friend believed strongly the end times were about to break forth and suggested a date of 1780 for that event. She modified her beliefs when that came and went and nothing happened. They preached against predestination, assuming that everyone had access to God and that salvation was universal, that was a big issue at the time. Was predestination was a huge issue in the religious life of America at that time. They preached sexual abstinence, advocated celibacy, but did not require it. And some of their Friends' followers were married, but marriage rates were way less than typical for the U.S. society. The notion here was you don't need to be distracted by marriage. You need to be focused on building the utopian community of God. That's the idea. So, as you might guess, the nonconformity to gender and all these teachings engendered a lot of real strong opposition. In one case, a riot broke out in Philadelphia with a crowd pelting their home, the Friend's home, with bricks. In response, they took the followers and moved to New York and established a community called Jerusalem. Seligman had a lot of problems, primarily from a group of men who rejected the idea of sharing all property. They had donated, they felt, more than their share to the community, and so they wanted more of the goods. And that's not the way it was organized. And so they were upset, and that was one big problem that they had. Opposition within the community increased, decidedly gendered. Only the men rebelled. Partially it was this sharing of resources, but also it was a lot of it was the idea that a non-male was leading the group. They didn't like that idea. So a group of their followers sued the Public Universal Friend for blasphemy. And this is an important thing. If you were a lawyer, you would know this case, because this was a landmark case. The judge ruled that the Constitution gave no judge the authority to rule on blasphemy. Of course they can't, because of the First Amendment, right? I mean, it's a slam dunk. I'm not a lawyer, but I could argue this case in court. You know, the First Amendment says you can't do that. You can't rule on blasphemy. But this is the precedent that they cite a lot of times when people keep trying to enforce religious conformity in the United States. Public Universal Friends' health declined, and they died in 1866. I mean, at the age of 66 in 1819. Movement struggled on, but without their leadership, it fell apart pretty much and didn't survive past the 1860s. So if you want to know more about this, this is the best probably source on that. It's a book that a religious scholar has written in 2015. Any questions about this? Okay, with what time we have left, let's talk about the other restoration movement now, okay? There were two restoration movements founded by Joseph Smith. You know about that one. But an unrelated movement, also called Restoration, founded by Barton Stone and the father-son team of Thomas and Alexander Campbell. And that took place in Kentucky and Pennsylvania, and they finally merged in the early 1830s, as I recall. Once the Joseph Smith restoration really took place, because they predated Joseph Smith's movement by 20 years or so, and once that took place, they both viewed each other as a threat. And in 1831, Alexander Campbell published a scathing critique of the Book of Mormon. But what's interesting is before his conversion to the LDS Church, Sidney Rigdon was a Campbellite minister. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. What they had in common was a strong belief that recreating the original New Testament church, that is, they were restoring the church that Jesus had made. That was a big deal. They both had nonconformist views of the Trinity, for example, essentially denying it as a true Christian faith. So Sidney Rigdon, here's his handsome face. Because of his background as a Campbellite minister, was almost certainly the most learned biblical scholar in the early restoration of Joseph Smith. And he was extremely influential. If you study the history of that period, you might recognize just how much Sidney Rigdon was involved in the early doctrine and dogma of the church. He was a very effective minister. He was made first counsel in the first presidency by Joseph Smith. In other words, the most important person in the first presidency besides Joseph Smith was Sidney Rigdon. And based on that, when Joseph Smith was killed, he claimed the presidency of the church. Brigham Young claimed the presidency of the church based on the fact that he was the president of the Council of 12. And so they basically had to decide who's going to be in charge, the apostles or the first presidency. That was the choice they made. And it's much more complicated than we can make it here. But they went with Brigham Young and the apostles. And that became, even today, the Mormon church always has the senior apostle becomes the next president of the church. Always. That's why all of their presidents are in their 80s and 90s. They're really old because takes time to become the senior member of the apostles. But Sidney Rigdon was Joseph Smith's scribe for his revision of the Bible. A lot of people think Sidney Rigdon helped with some of the words. Wasn't just recording them. A discredited theory suggests he was a primary author of the Book of Mormon. That's discredited now by most scholars, but it was a strong theory for a long time. And Smith and Rigdon jointly experienced and recorded the vision of the degrees of glory, which was an extremely important theological concept in the early restoration of Smith and a very important part of Mormonism today. Their afterlife ideas are all dependent on the degrees of glory. So let's compare the two. The Campbell restoration versus the Smith restoration. Campbell's restoring the New Testament church. Smith restoration's original goal was to restore the New Testament church. That changed as time went on. Sense of revelation was the revealed scriptures of the New Testament. For Joseph Smith, revelation came from inspiration through the Holy Spirit. So they had different ideas about inspiration. All attempts to create forms, theology, and structure of the New Testament church came only from the Bible. For Joseph Smith, structural ontology included additional scriptures which deviated from the New Testament view of the Bible and brought other ideas. Campbell was postmillennial, emphasis on preparing for the 1,000-year millennial reign, which they believe could be ushered in by the church's action. So people could trigger the 1,000-year reign. Joseph Smith focused on the immediate end-time apocalypse. The purpose of the church was to build Zion as a refuge from the horrors of the apocalypse. And one of the most important characteristics of this Campbell restoration was it strongly resisted the formation of denominations. He did not like denominations at all. He wanted one universal Christian church. And this was really strong, still a major teaching in the successor churches. Smith felt that his movement was unique and more correct due to revelation than other Christian churches and was the one true church. So he just simply ignored other churches. So here are the founders, Barton Stone and the Campbells, which is father and son. Both Barton Stone and Thomas Campbell were Presbyterian ministers. Both left the church or were kind of kicked out. But Barton Stone left because he did not believe in predestination. And Thomas Campbell left because of his ecumenicalism. Is that a word? His ecumenical of views. He was serving communion to people who weren't Presbyterians. And they got rid of him in a minute. And then Alexander Campbell came over, was in Scotland as his son, came over at the age of 21 to help his father with his ministry in 1809, as I recall. And Alexander Campbell became the most powerful leader in the movement. He eclipsed his father pretty quickly. So let's look at how this started. I wanted to get to this if we could. The Cane Ridge Revival Meeting. Barton Stone launched the Restoration Movement in 1801 through a revival in Cane Ridge, Kentucky. This is by far the granddaddy of all revivals. It's the granddaddy of all camp meetings. It was the largest one, perhaps ever. It was also maybe the first one, and it set the pattern for all the ones which became so important in the Second Great Awakening. As many as 20,000 people came to this remote little area of rural Kentucky, which was about 10% of the entire population of Kentucky at the time. And here's a period diagram showing what it might have looked like. That's not a photograph. I didn't have a photograph of this Cane Ridge. I took one, but it was kind of fuzzy. It was kind of out of focus, so I didn't use it. Stone was preaching fervently at this meeting and insisted on the sole authority of the Bible, the end of denominations, and the unity of the Christian church through the restoration of the New Testament primitive church. Thousands were saved. Thousands were saved. So he had a ready, built-in congregation, there. And he soon left the Presbyterian church, decided he just wanted to be part of a broader Christian church. Key beliefs: Christian freedom. This is from Barton Stone. The basic belief on which everything else was built. He abandoned all creeds, denominations, theology, and traditions that had developed over time. All that was legitimate was the primitive Christian church based on the Christian Bible. The New Testament church. That's all that he ever accepted. Millennialism was important and coming soon. He was a postmillennialist, like Alexander Campbell. But unlike Alexander Campbell, felt that humans were too degraded to have anything to do with bringing it to pass. Alexander Campbell thought people would do this. Barton Stone said God would do this. And so his focus was on holy and righteous living, getting ready for the millennial reign. He taught that people should live as if the kingdom of God was already here. It's probably a good way to approach Christianity. So pacifism, rejection of violence, greed, materialism, and slavery, they rejected all of those things, and also did not participate in civil government. Because who needs it? We got the kingdom of God is coming. The Campbell wing began in 1809. The Presbyterian Church had withdrawn his ministerial credentials because of his ecumenicalism. And he wrote a response to that, and that launched his movement. And so it became an association by 1811 in Western Pennsylvania. Alexander Campbell came to help. It should be noted that they were very proud of their Scottish heritage. They were both born in Scotland and both immigrated to the United States. Don't tell ICE, because I'm sure that would be inappropriate. But they were very proud of their Scottish heritage. One of their current successors is the Disciples of Christ. They use as their logo a chalice with the Scottish cross of St. Andrew on it. This is their official logo. So they still hold that Scottish identity somewhat. So Alexander Campbell wanted to distinguish between what he felt was essential and what was not essential. And he basically divided Christian practices into two groups. The essential ones were congregational autonomy. In other words, congregations were the unit of the church. Okay? Authority of congregational elders, which is, of course, what Joseph Smith was all about too. This was a common thing at the time in the Second Great Awakening. He felt weekly communion, the sacrament of communion, was essential. And the baptismal immersion for the remissions of sins. That sounds awful lot like Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith would have signed on to all of these. The non-essential stuff was women priesthood. There were women in the priesthood at the time, and he said, no, that's not essential. We're not going to do that. Communal living, well, we don't need to do that. You can do it, I guess, if you want, but it's not essential. Foot washing, which was apparently a rural passion for a lot of people because it was in the Bible, right? Jesus washed the disciples' feet, so let's wash feet. As you know, the Mormon Church still has a sacrament of foot washing. So this comes from that same thing. Charismatic exercises, he didn't really like that, all this emotional, stuff. And the holy kiss was not essential. And I thought we might take a moment and talk about the holy kiss. Because I got off looking at that and found it kind of interesting. What?
Correct.
Yeah. So kissing as a greeting was widespread at the time of the Bible. Everybody kissed when you met somebody. Typically men kissed men and women kissed women. When men kissed women, and vice versa, it was more romantic. But men kissing men and women kissing women was okay. This kiss was given mouth to mouth, not mouth to cheek. So you kissed on the mouth. And this was really common in the biblical world. So it's clear that Jesus and his followers kissed in greeting. That's why Judas Iscariot identified Jesus with a kiss when he betrayed him in the garden. It was just a logical way of identifying who Jesus was. The kiss was almost certainly on the mouth, but more recent visual representations always show it to be on the cheek. And I thought this was interesting. So going back to 1304, they're showing Judas betraying Jesus with a kiss on the mouth. He's about to kiss him on the mouth. He hasn't quite got there in the painting. By 1600, he's kissing on the cheek. And then recent stuff doesn't have a kiss at all. This is a very recent picture I found in which Jesus is doing this, like implying there had been a kiss, but they don't show it. So what we're seeing is here, of course, the sexualization of this and the whole idea of homosexuality being bad, which was not the case in the biblical days, but that's where we are now. And evangelicals are really hot on this issue. They do not want to ever show Jesus kissing a man. Now, the early Christian church elevated this cultural tradition of kissing as a greeting to a near sacrament in the early Christian church, the early Christian biblical church. In devotion, in communal worship, those that were baptized were to greet one another with a kiss and a verbal statement wishing peace for the other person. That's how you greeted people. And it was only for baptized Christians because the kiss was so important that it had to be limited to those who were saved. You didn't do it to people who weren't baptized. Christians are told 5 times in the New Testament scriptures to greet one another with a holy kiss in 5 different books. Now, in recent times, the kiss has largely been discontinued. I found a couple of denominations which still have it, one which still has it as a sacrament. But for the most part, almost, and they're small, kind of peripheral. For the most part, they've discontinued the kiss. It's replaced with passing the peace, which you've probably run into if you've done any ecumenical worship. And that's a replacement for that. That's the evolution of the holy kiss. In this, the worshipers wish one another peace while shaking their hand or maybe giving a hug, something like that. Anyway, I thought that was interesting, and we're out of time. So we don't have time to pursue this anymore. But why is that green? I did not make it that way. But anyway, the two groups, Stone and Campbell's, merged finally. And the name was the hardest part because Stone absolutely said has to be called just Christians based on this scripture from Acts. The disciples were called Christians first in Antioch. Alexander Campbell insisted on disciples of Christ. They could not agree. They beat each other over this. And they finally decided to use both names, which is why today we have a church called the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. Okay? So today we have 3 successor churches, Churches of Christ, unaffiliated ones, and Christian Church. This is mostly a southern church. This is mostly a northern church. This is mostly a rural church. This is mostly an urban church. Okay? And that's it. They're all over Africa, which you guys probably know because there's Malawi. And you probably saw some there. But they're all over Africa. So that's it. I'm done. And I'm only 5 minutes late. Yes?
Churches of Christ, is this the Church of Christ?
I don't know what Churches of Christ is.
You
Oh, what this? You mean this is? Okay, yeah. This is what I saw was the name of their church, was Churches of Christ. Church of Christ may be the same thing, and I don't know. I don't want to say that I know because I don't.
And then I think there is like a Church of Christ meets here is actually what I heard is different than the Church of Christ.
Church of Christ is going to be a name that everybody's going to want, right? So I'm sure there's all kinds of varieties of that.
My favorite. But you're saying that they're all kind of
Well, I don't know that. I don't know if they're related to this or not. They could be just somebody else who had a good idea and wandered off and founded his own movement.
I was thinking, so in Mount Pleasant, Michigan, which is my home congregation, so we had the ROBS, Community Christ Church.
Yeah.
And then about a block away, there was a church that was a Church of Christ here. And I think I would be interesting to know if they were.
Are you looking that up, Matt? Thank you.
So, yeah, so I just, it's interesting that the proximity that those, that kind of a similar denomination as
Yeah.
It's related or
So Church of Christ, Churches of Christ, and Church of Christ Meets Here are all coming out of the same that might be what they use, and maybe they were in what I was reading. They pluraled it to indicate that it was multiple congregations. I don't know, but Church of Christ I thought was the same group, but I didn't want to say for sure because I didn't know. But Matt knows.
I think if you, I'm going to zoom out a little bit. The denomination can be Churches of Christ, but on one of your slides, one of your first slides, the congregational unit was primary.
Yeah.
So
Church of Christ
is the primary congregational
that
unit,
makes sense.
and then the parent organization is Churches of Christ.
That makes sense.
So the Church of Christ is what it would be, but when you look at the court, yeah.
Well,
So yeah.
And Linda's right. The Church of Christ is all over the South.
Yeah.
That's the southern one. The Disciples of Christ are in the north. I think they may have split over slavery, and like the Baptists did, and like a lot of churches did. A lot of churches split over slavery, whether they supported or be against it. It could have been that too. I don't know.
My favorite church that we saw in Africa was the last Church of Christ.
The last Church of Christ.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Don't keep looking because this is the last
one.
This is where you come. Good for them.
First or second, we've seen like Second Church of Christ.
Yeah.
And other things.
I like the First Baptist Church. I'm going like, how can there be 2,000 First Baptist churches?
What?
One of them had to be first, right? And the rest are all lined. The second one is, and there's the Second Baptist Church. Yeah, I've seen that too.
And there's American one.
Well, Southern Baptists took that name when they split with the Baptist thing over slavery. So, but isn't that just the name of the church? It's a Baptist church. I think it's a Southern Baptist Church which has the name Calvary. Yeah. What do you remember what the one in Platteville is? I know where it is. I'm not sure what their name is. So, thank you.
Thank you, Rich.
Thank you.
Recording.